the reliability of the Red Bull's very much in question in race 1. They got it right in race 2. There was some fragility around the transmission area of the Mercs in race 1. As we know, they finished, and of course they had the 1-2 in the Styrian Grand Prix. But what is going on there? This is all coming under the heading of electronic noise, we hear.
Yes, both the Mercedes Race 1 and Red Bull's Race 1 issues were around electronics, albeit driven in some respects from mechanical things, particularly with Red Bull. And what we have, so if we look at the Mercedes, first of all, they've been very open. Mercedes are fantastic in this respect over the past few years. They've come and said that it's electronic noise, so you have wiring throughout the gearbox running to all sorts of sensors, and that wiring obviously has then the sensors itself, and it's at the rear axle, so you've got the vibration from the suspension and the movement from the drive shafts all shaking that transmission casing. And as these electronics are shaking about, you get electronic noise, and what that means is that the sensors maybe aren't giving the ECU the accurate readings that ECU is expecting. Now, for lots of things like temperatures and stuff, it's not really that important if a sensor doesn't tell you what the oil temperature is every hundredth of a second. But with these current gearboxes, if the sensor's telling you the position of each piece of the gearbox in terms of the input shaft, the output shaft, the dogs on the gears, if that isn't absolutely accurate and with no problems or no latency between the reading and telling the ECU, then you can't have this seamless gear shift. And the seamless gear shift, as we remember, as teams went over it a few years ago, it's all based on the very accurate positioning of the gearbox before the hydraulics change the gear without having to lift off the power at all from the engine. Now, this was worth about 0.2, 0.3 of a second in lap time, as I remember when teams first started to adopt this technology. So during a race, having to slow the gear shift down to a stage where you're happy that the sensors are giving you the accurate data so that you don't get a misshift, which obviously would absolutely destroy the gearbox, is going to cost a lot of time. Red Bull, their problem was two separate electronic problems, both by what you could describe as mechanical problems. With Max, it was quite interesting. His initial problems, Christian Horner said it was in the flywheel. Now, the flywheel doesn't really exist in a Formula One car. You don't need that mass keeping the engine even on tick over. You want as little flywheel as possible. What flywheel there is actually in the clutch, which only weighs a kilo, so it doesn't have a huge effect. But probably from going over the curbs, Max has again upset a sensor somewhere around the clutch, and again you saw him kind of kangarooing like a learner driver trying to get that car working, suggesting it was perhaps in the transmission, more specifically within the clutch, which actually sits on the Honda engine, so it sits on the back of the crank at the back of the engine. Albon meanwhile had another issue over the curbs. He was obviously hit fairly substantially by Lewis Hamilton during the overtaking manoeuvre, went over the curbs, and while Honda and Red Bull haven't said exactly what was going on, subsequent we know that the control electronics for the ERS system, I think it was the ERSK for the MG UK, the KERS motor on the engine, was replaced. And in between the two races, Honda have looked at everything, actually sent parts away to Japan for testing and to Milton Keynes where their UK base is, checked everything, decided the only thing that needed changing in terms of substantial items was the control electronics, the inverter, which takes the power from the battery and sends it to the ERS motor on the engine. So again, stuff being shaken about. So if you kind of pull these all together, it's like, why is this so unusual? Obviously, only I think it was about 10 finishes in race 1 in Austria. Maybe the situation in race 2 will be a lot better. So if you think normally teams go and do a couple of weeks of testing at Barcelona, they'll do a few shakedown runs at Silverstone and stuff. They then go through a series of races, and all these little problems that would crop up there would normally get sorted out by the time you get to a very aggressive circuit like Austria. But if you have race 1 in Austria, all of those problems get hit big time straight out in the first race, and that's exactly what we saw. Vibrations from the curbs and from the cars pushing so hard around that lap was really upsetting, the electronics and lots of other system on other people's cars. It's worth noting Mercedes have probably had more engine failures than the other manufacturer so far. Their engine is looking fairly fragile. We saw the Racing Point's smoking quite badly at the start of a stint. If you look at the Red Bull halos and the Ferrari halos at the first few races when they were behind a Mercedes, you could see oil streaks on the halos as well. So lots of potential little reliability issues here that weren't able to be sorted out over the relatively easy opening races that we'd normally have. But Austria has come to punish them, and it has done quite badly for several of those drivers so far this year. So this, I don't think it's going to be a pattern we'll see for the rest of the year. Teams will now, obviously, you've got a very short break till Hungary, but Hungary isn't a track that creates problems other than overheating problems. Potentially a problem for Renault, which have had 2 radiator failures over the first 2 races. Quite worrying for them. Again, something that they buy their cores in from probably someone like PWR in Australia, and then put the end tanks and the connectors on themselves. But 2 radiator failures over 2 races is highly unusual. Again, potentially to do with the vibrations that you get in Austria in particular. But as we go through this, I think the reliability will go back to the usual situation where you get barely any retirements through the race.
The only thing that's slightly odd is that as a result of Alex Peroni's big shunt in the Formula 3 race at Monza last year, they are using more loops now in the curbs to define circuit limits. And therefore the implication is fewer big sausage type curbs. And yet we still see Austria as a mega curb circuit. In theory, it should be less damaging this year than it was last.
I think there's 2 types of curbs that we've got. You've got the sausage curbs and the big yellow curbs that we saw Leclerc bump over at the start of the race. They're there obviously to manage track limits, but then you have the corrugated curbs, and I think it's these curbs which the teams, the drivers regularly run on the way into a corner at the apex and on the exit in particular. And it's those high frequency vibrations that are really affecting the cars over these first couple of races. As I say, we'll get to Hungary and things will be ever so slightly different.
Although remember in Hungary, coming out of the 4th last corner of the lap, that quick right-hander down the hill. Remember 4 or 5 years ago, Perez in the Force India had the left rear suspension collapse as a result of that resonation over the curb. Exactly that.
It is definitely. I mean, there's punishing curbs on everything. I think Austria is just a track where you've got so many of them at very high speed, and obviously it's the frequency of the vibration that's the problem. And again, someone was asking me over Twitter about, was this to do with the Mercedes gearbox? Because obviously they've changed their gearbox this year or not the gearbox, but the carbon fibre rear case that the gearbox sits inside. And they've changed their rear suspension quite substantially as well. They've effectively reversed the lower wishbones and track rods to get slightly better aerodynamic setup. Now, that someone suggested to me, was that because of a weakness in this new gearbox? I don't think it's a weakness as such, but the teams get used to certain vibrations and the certain natural frequencies of components on the cars, and they design things around it. The first thing that they do when they go testing is do vibration checking. Obviously, with the limited testing, with the first race being in Austria, they're getting a different frequency coming through the cars from these curbs and from the current tyres and everything. So it's just a little bit of learning for the teams. But again, I'm fairly confident that they'll all very soon get on top of this and it'll all be forgotten. And sadly, we're going to have races with nearly 20 finishes. I actually thought it was quite exciting when you've got almost 10 DNFs. The people at the bottom of the grid get their chance to fight up and get some points for a change.